The heavy glass doors of the gilded aisle hissed shut behind Kenji Chen, cutting off the humid summer air and replacing it with the sterile, sandalwood-scented chill of extreme wealth. Kenji took a slow breath, feeling the air conditioning bite into the sweat on the back of his neck. He looked out of place, and he knew it. His hoodie was a faded charcoal gray, frayed at the cuffs and stained with a stubborn patch of motor oil from a morning spent under a car hood. His jeans were baggy, his boots were scuffed, and his backpack looked like it had survived a war zone. To anyone else, he looked like a man who had lost his way or was looking for a place to hide from the sun. But beneath the hood, Kenji's eyes were sharp, scanning the perimeter with a precision that didn't match his ragged appearance. Marcus Thorne stood behind the polished mahogany concierge desk, adjusting the gold pin on his lapel. The moment Kenji's boots hit the Italian marble floor, Marcus's spine stiffened. He didn't see a customer, he saw a threat to the aesthetic of his meticulously curated world. Marcus checked his Rolex, a gold-plated monster that screamed status, and let out a long, audible sigh. He didn't approach Kenji immediately. Instead, he signaled to a nearby clerk with a sharp flick of his wrist, pointing toward the problem that had just walked in. When the clerk hesitated, Marcus rolled his eyes, smoothed his Italian-cut suit jacket, and began a slow, predatory walk toward the organic produce section. He wasn't walking to help, he was walking to hover. Kenji reached out a calloused hand toward a display of heirloom tomatoes, his fingers hovering just inches from the fruit. He could feel the heat of a gaze burning into the back of his head. He didn't turn around. He knew exactly where Marcus was. The floor manager was pretending to reorganize a shelf of artisanal balsamic vinegar 6 feet away, but his eyes were fixed on Kenji's tattered backpack. Every time Kenji moved, Marcus moved. It was a silent, suffocating dance of suspicion. Marcus's nostrils flared as if he could smell the poverty he assumed Kenji carried with him. The tension in the aisle spiked when Mrs. Sterling rounded the corner. She was the neighborhood's self-appointed queen, draped in cream-colored cashmere and clutching a designer handbag like it was a holy relic. She was busy checking her reflection in a refrigerated glass door until she nearly collided with Kenji. She recoiled as if she had touched a live wire, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. She didn't look at Kenji, she looked over him, straight at Marcus. She didn't even lower her voice. She simply pointed a manicured finger and whispered loudly that the store was starting to feel unsafe. She mentioned something about suspicious elements, and people who clearly aren't here to buy anything, her eyes darting toward Kenji's backpack with a paranoid intensity. Marcus didn't miss his cue. He stepped forward, his chest puffed out, a smug, practiced sneer playing on his lips. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply stood in Kenji's path, blocking his access to the premium wine aisle. The air between them grew thick with an unspoken hostility. Marcus leaned in slightly, the smell of his expensive cologne clashing with the earthy scent of Kenji's work clothes. He spoke in a low, condescending tone, the kind of voice used for a disobedient child. He asked if Kenji was lost, or if he was perhaps looking for the discount bodega 3 blocks over. Kenji finally looked up, his face unreadable. He didn't look scared, and he didn't look angry, which seemed to irritate Marcus even more. Kenji reached for a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, his fingers grazing the dusty glass. Before his hand could close around the neck, Marcus's hand shot out, gripping Kenji's wrist with unnecessary force. The manager's voice boomed through the quiet store, drawing the eyes of every wealthy shopper nearby. He asked Kenji if he could even afford the tax on a bottle like that, or if he was just looking for an easy exit. The hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy, expectant silence of a crowd watching a public execution. Kenji looked down at the hand on his wrist, then back up at Marcus, his voice a calm, chilling contrast to the manager's aggression. He told Marcus he was simply checking the year, but the manager wasn't listening. Marcus signaled for Dave, the burly security guard by the entrance, his face flushed with the power of the moment. He told Kenji that either the bag stayed at the front or he needed to get out, but Kenji gripped the straps tighter, stating firmly that the bag contained sensitive personal property. As Dave closed in, the trap Marcus didn't know he was setting began to tighten around them both. The fluorescent lights of the holding room flickered with a rhythmic, irritating buzz that felt like a needle pressing against Kenji's temple. As he sat on the cold metal chair, the sterile environment faded, and the walls seemed to dissolve into the hazy, humid air of 10 years ago. In his mind, he was no longer a suspected shoplifter in a stained hoodie. He was Captain Kenji Chen, standing in a command center illuminated by the blue glow of tactical monitors. He remembered the weight of the uniform, the starch of the collar against his neck, and the immense responsibility of coordinating deep-cover operations for military intelligence. He had spent years learning how to disappear into the background, how to observe without being seen, and how to strike only when the evidence was absolute. He had been a ghost in the machine, a man trained to protect a country that often looked at his face with suspicion before they ever saw his rank. But the iron in his soul hadn't come from the military, it had come from watching his father break. The memory shifted to a dusty, sun-drenched corner store on the edge of the city. He could still smell the sweet scent of ripened oranges and the metallic tang of the old cash register. He saw his father, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the ink of newspaper bundles and the soil of fresh produce, smiling at a neighbor. That smile had vanished the day a younger, hungrier Marcus Thorne arrived. Marcus hadn't been a floor manager then, he had been a junior executive for a massive retail conglomerate, a hatchet man sent to clear out inefficiencies. Kenji remembered the way Marcus had walked into their family shop, his expensive shoes crunching on the worn linoleum like he was walking through a junkyard. Marcus hadn't even looked his father in the eye. He had simply tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the counter, his lip curled in a permanent sneer of superiority. He had mocked his father's accent, laughing with a colleague about how these small-time immigrant shops were a blight on the neighborhood's new vision. Kenji had watched from the back room as his father's shoulders slumped, the pride of 30 years of honest work crushed by a man who saw people as nothing more than line items on a spreadsheet. The vision snapped back to the present as Marcus slammed a hand onto the table in the holding room. The arrogance hadn't changed, it had only fermented. Marcus began rifling through Kenji's pockets with a rough, disrespectful haste, his fingers snagging on the fabric of the old hoodie. He pulled out a crumpled receipt and tossed it aside like trash, his eyes burning with a sadistic kind of glee. Marcus leaned down, his breath smelling of expensive espresso and cold ambition. He told Kenji that people like him were a cancer to a zip code like this. He whispered that he was going to make it his personal mission to ensure Kenji never found work in this town again, promising to blackball him until he was forced to crawl back to whatever hole he came from. Kenji sat perfectly still, his hands resting in his lap. He didn't flinch at the insults. He didn't beg. Instead, he tilted his head and looked directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He knew that miles away, in a nondescript van, a team of auditors was watching this very moment. He knew that inside his battered backpack, hidden beneath a decoy layer of old clothes, a high-tech thermal scanner was vibrating, confirming that it had successfully captured the digital signatures of the store's internal server. Marcus thought he was bullying a vagrant, but Kenji was playing a much larger game. He was the ghost again, and the man who had once destroyed his father's life was currently handing him the rope to hang himself. Kenji felt a cold, hard sense of purpose settle in his chest. The pain of the past was no longer a burden, it was a blueprint for the justice that was about to unfold. He looked Marcus in the eye, a faint, terrifyingly calm shadow of a smile touching his lips, and realized that some people never learn that the person they are stepping on today might just be the one who owns the floor tomorrow. The heavy thud of the holding room door swinging open announced the arrival of the police. 2 officers entered, their belts jingling with the weight of metal and authority, their presence turning the small, windowless space into a pressure cooker. Marcus Thorne didn't miss a beat. He immediately transformed into a victim of professional duty, smoothing his tie and gesturing toward Kenji with a look of profound weariness. He told the officers that it was a crying shame, really, but that they had caught this man red-handed trying to walk out with a $1,200 bottle of vintage Bordeaux. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, his voice dripping with a fake, oily sincerity as he explained that he tried to be patient, but these people always took advantage of kindness. While the officers began their questioning, Marcus moved with the practiced stealth of a predator. He stepped toward Kenji's open backpack, which sat on a metal table just out of the officer's direct line of sight. With a flick of his wrist that was almost too fast to see, he pulled a small, gold-rimmed tin of premium beluga caviar from his blazer pocket and let it slide deep into the shadows of the bag's side pocket. He looked up, his eyes meeting Sarah's. The young clerk was standing in the doorway, her hands trembling as she held a stack of inventory clips. She had seen it. She saw the silver glint of the tin as it vanished into Kenji's belongings. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply stared at her, his eyes narrowing into two cold slits of steel. He didn't have to say a word. The message was written in the harsh lines of his face. One word from you, and you're back on the street. Sarah looked down at her scuffed shoes, her heart hammering against her ribs, and remained silent. The click of the handcuffs was loud and final in the quiet room. The metal bit into Kenji's wrists, cold and unyielding. The officers didn't ask for his side of the story. They simply listened to Marcus and the loud, frantic narration of Mrs. Sterling, who was standing just outside the door filming the entire scene on her gold-plated smartphone. She was telling her followers about the bravery of the store management and the scourge of shoplifters ruining the neighborhood. Kenji looked around the room, searching for a single face that held a shred of doubt or a flicker of compassion. He saw the wealthy shoppers peering in, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to active hostility, as if his very presence was an insult to their afternoon. No one spoke up. No one questioned why a man who looked like he hadn't eaten a hot meal in days would be trying to steal a bottle of wine he couldn't possibly resell. As the officers began to lead Kenji through the store toward the patrol car, the humiliation was choreographed for maximum impact. Marcus followed closely behind, his voice raised just enough to ensure the entire checkout line could hear him. He shouted that the Gilded Isle had zero tolerance for thugs and that he would personally see to it that the neighborhood remained pure. It was a public shaming, a digital age stocks and pillory display. Sarah stood by the sliding glass doors, her eyes red-rimmed and moist. As Kenji passed her, she leaned in, her voice a mere ghost of a sound, whispering that she was so sorry. Kenji didn't stop, and he didn't look defeated. He gave her a single, subtle nod, a silent signal of reassurance that only she could see. The patrol car door slammed shut with a heavy, mechanical thud, muffling the sounds of Marcus's triumphant laughter and Mrs. Sterling's shrill commentary. Kenji sat in the cramped backseat, the smell of stale upholstery and old coffee filling his senses. He looked out the window at Marcus, who was standing on the curb with his arms crossed, looking like a king surveying his kingdom. Kenji leaned toward the plexiglass divider and spoke to the officer in a voice that was eerily calm, devoid of any fear. He told the officer that Marcus should have checked the inventory levels before he planted that caviar. The officer frowned, looking in the rearview mirror, but Kenji just closed his eyes. That night, sitting in a cold, concrete holding cell with the smell of floor wax and regret, Kenji didn't call a lawyer. He reached for the one phone call he was allowed and spoke 5 words into the receiver. Phase 2 begins at the grand reopening. The morning sun filtered through the high, barred windows of the precinct, casting long, geometric shadows across the linoleum floor. Kenji walked out of the station doors a free man, but to the rest of the world, he was a ghost with a criminal record. The local news blogs had already done their work, fueled by Mrs. Sterling's viral video. The headlines screamed about a vagrant caught preying on the neighborhood's crown jewel. Officially, he had been released due to a lack of evidence because the store's high-definition footage of the actual theft had mysteriously glitched at the exact moment Marcus claimed to have seen the bottle slide into the bag. But the victory felt hollow to any observer. Kenji was banned for life from the Gilded Isle, branded a thief by the court of public opinion, and left with nothing but the clothes on his back and his tattered backpack. A sleek, black SUV with deep-tinted windows pulled up to the curb, its engine purring with the quiet confidence of extreme horsepower. The door opened, and Kenji stepped inside, the atmosphere immediately shifting from the grit of the street to the scent of expensive leather and high-end electronics. Leo, Kenji's lead assistant, sat in the back with a glowing tablet in hand. He didn't offer pity, he offered data. Leo handed the device over, and as Kenji swiped through the files, the tired, defeated look in his eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a chess master about to declare checkmate. The secret revelation was more damning than they had even dared to hope. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a petty bully with a badge, he was a sophisticated parasite. The tablet showed side-by-side comparisons of inventory logs and black market sales. Marcus had been systematically flagging high-end items, vintage wines, caviar, Wagyu beef, as spoiled or damaged in transit, only to move them through a shell company to private collectors. He was laundering the pride of the store into an offshore account that was currently bloating with stolen millions. The midpoint of the struggle had been reached, but the hero was no longer a victim. Kenji leaned back against the headrest, a predatory stillness coming over him. He realized that Marcus's greatest weakness wasn't his greed, but his assumption that someone who looked poor was also powerless. The mindset shifted. Kenji wasn't going to just clear his name, he was going to dismantle Marcus's entire reality. He instructed Leo to prepare the final acquisition papers. Instead of reacting with the hot, messy anger of the wounded, Kenji decided to play the long game, using the very prejudice that had seen him handcuffed as the smokescreen for his counterattack. Later that afternoon, under the canopy of an old oak tree in a quiet public park, Kenji met with Sarah. She arrived looking frayed, her eyes darting around as if Marcus might spring from the bushes at any moment. Kenji stood up, and for the first time, he let the disguise slip. He stood tall, his voice dropping the hesitant, soft-spoken tone of the vagrant, and adopting the resonant authority of a man who owned the very air he breathed. He showed her the shop photo of his father, then he showed her his true credentials. Sarah's jaw dropped, her breath catching in her throat as she realized who she had really been trying to protect. Kenji told her that the store was going to change, but he needed her to be his eyes on the inside for one more day. He promised her that by tomorrow night, Marcus Thorne would realize that the trash he tried to sweep away was actually the storm that was about to level his house. Sarah looked at the photo of Kenji's father, then back at Kenji, and she nodded. The alliance was sealed in the quiet shade of the park, and as Kenji watched her walk away, he knew the pieces were finally in place. While Kenji worked in the shadows, Marcus Thorne was basking in the golden glow of his own perceived brilliance. Inside his glass-walled office overlooking the sales floor, Marcus reclined in his leather chair, swirling a glass of scotch that cost more than a month of his cashier's rent. He watched the janitorial staff scrubbing the floors in preparation for the upcoming Gold Gala, a smug grin plastered across his face. To him, the world was back in its proper orbit. He had successfully excised the trash from his store. The viral video of the arrest was giving the boutique a reputation for exclusivity, and he was virtually certain the regional promotion was his. He laughed to himself, imagining the look on that Asian kid's face when he realized he'd picked a fight with the wrong man. Marcus felt untouchable, a king who had successfully defended his border against a peasant. Meanwhile, a few miles away in a high-tech command center hidden within a nondescript office park, the real work was being done with surgical silence. Kenji had shed the grease-stained hoodie for a sharp, slate-gray tactical polo. He sat surrounded by a team of forensic accountants whose fingers flew across keyboards like concert pianists. The air in the room was electric with focused energy. They weren't just looking for mistakes, they were tracing a digital blood trail. Every time Marcus had moved a shipment of truffles or intercepted a crate of vintage champagne, he had left a fingerprint in the store's backend logistics. Fingerprints that Kenji's undercover device had spent 48 hours vacuuming into his backpack. The grind was slow and meticulous. Kenji watched as the software mapped out Marcus's offshore accounts, connecting the dots between spoiled inventory and a series of wire transfers to a bank in the Cayman Islands. He felt no rush, no frantic need for revenge. He felt the cold, rhythmic satisfaction of a predator closing the distance. He picked up his phone and made a series of quiet, low-voiced calls to the district attorney's office and a high-profile firm of corporate litigators. Each conversation was a brick in a wall that was slowly moving to crush Marcus Thorne. Back at the store, subtle shifts were happening that Marcus was too blinded by ego to see. A fleet of unmarked delivery trucks arrived at the loading dock, but the men unloading the crates didn't look like the usual union drivers. They were tall, fit, and wore earpieces tucked discreetly behind their ears. Kenji's hand-picked audit team, disguised as gala catering staff. Sarah moved among them, her face a mask of nervous professional composure. She quietly directed them to the storage rooms where Marcus kept his private stashes, her heart pounding as she slipped the master ledgers from the manager's desk into an empty floral delivery box. As the sun began to set on the day before the gala, Kenji stood on a hill overlooking the affluent suburb. The lights of the neighborhood began to twinkle like fallen stars. He thought about his father, the way the man's hands used to shake as he tried to explain to the bank why his shop was failing. He thought about the years he spent in the military, learning that the most dangerous weapon in the world wasn't a gun or a bomb, but the truth. He checked his watch, a simple, rugged timepiece that held more history than Marcus's gold Rolex ever would. The tables weren't just turning, they were being rebuilt from the ground up. He took a long, steady breath of the evening air, knowing that tomorrow, the man who thought he had won would finally learn the difference between being a boss and being a leader. The Gilded Isle had been transformed into a cathedral of excess for the Gold Gala. A long red carpet stretched from the curb to the entrance, flanked by velvet ropes and paparazzi whose flashes turned the humid evening into a rhythmic strobe light. Inside, the scent of white truffles and expensive lilies hung heavy in the air, competing with the sharp, alcoholic bite of vintage champagne. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, their music a sophisticated backdrop to the sound of crystal clinking and the low, self-important hum of the town's elite. Marcus Thorne moved through the crowd like a conquering hero, his tuxedo fitted so perfectly it looked painted on. He stopped every few feet to clasp a hand or offer a rehearsed laugh, his ego swelling with every compliment. To Marcus, this wasn't just a store anniversary, it was his coronation. On the small stage near the grand wine display, Marcus took the microphone, the feedback let out a sharp chirp that silenced the room. He spoke about excellence, about the sanctity of the shopping experience, and the hard work it took to keep their community safe and refined. He looked directly at Mrs. Sterling, who was standing in the front row, and she gave him a coy, knowing nod. But as Marcus reached the climax of his speech, the heavy glass doors at the front of the store hissed open. The atmosphere shifted instantly. A hush rippled through the room as a man stepped onto the marble floor. He was wearing a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo that caught the light with every step, the fabric rippling like liquid ink. It was Kenji, but he wasn't the tired, grease-stained ghost from 3 days ago. He stood with a military posture, his chin held high, radiating an aura of such immense quiet power that the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. Behind him followed a phalanx of men in dark, identical suits, not security guards, but executives. Marcus froze, the microphone trembling in his hand. His face contorted, the smugness curdling into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't even wait for Kenji to speak. He practically lunged off the stage, pointing a trembling finger. He screamed for security, his voice cracking with a hysterical edge as he demanded to know how this trash had gotten past the ropes. He turned to the crowd, shouting that this was the thief from the news, the shoplifter who had tried to ruin their store. Mrs. Sterling joined in, her voice a shrill piercing whistle as she demanded the animal be removed immediately. Kenji didn't stop. He didn't even blink. He walked straight up to Marcus until they were inches apart. Marcus reached out to grab Kenji's lapel, his face purple with fury, intending to physically throw him out. But before his hand could make contact, Leo stepped forward and intercepted Marcus's arm with a grip like a steel vise. Leo didn't say a word, he simply handed a gold-embossed card to the store's head of security, who had rushed over to intervene. The guard looked at the card, then at Kenji, and then slowly stepped back, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. He lowered his head and stood aside. Marcus was panting now, his eyes darting around the room as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. He turned back to Kenji, his voice a desperate, ugly snarl, asking him what kind of sick joke this was. He told Kenji that no matter what suit he stole, he was still nothing but a nobody from the gutter. Kenji just looked at him with a gaze that was both pitying and final. The jazz music had stopped. The only sound in the room was the heavy, jagged breathing of a man whose world was about to vanish. Leo stepped to the microphone Marcus had dropped and his voice boomed through the high-ceilinged store. He announced to the stunned assembly that they should show some respect, because they were standing in the presence of the new majority shareholder and chairman of the board of the Global Retail Alliance. He introduced the man they had all mocked as Mr. Kenji Chen. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it had physical weight, pressing the air out of Marcus Thorne's lungs. The silence in the store was brittle, a frozen moment of collective shock that felt as though it might shatter under the weight of a single breath. Marcus Thorne stood paralyzed, his mouth slightly agape, his face rapidly draining of color until he looked like a wax figure of himself. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound escaped his throat. Behind him, the massive high-definition screens that usually displayed slow-motion videos of sparkling champagne and organic honey suddenly flickered. The jazz music didn't return. Instead, a harsh, grainy audio began to play over the state-of-the-art sound system. Every head in the room turned as the screens synchronized to show the security footage from 3 days prior. It wasn't the edited version Marcus had provided to the police. It was the raw, wide-angle feed from a hidden pinhole camera Marcus hadn't known existed. The crowd gasped in unison as they watched the digital playback of Marcus reaching into his blazer, pulling out a tin of caviar, and surreptitiously sliding it into Kenji's backpack. The betrayal of trust was naked and undeniable, projected in 40-foot clarity for the entire town to see. Then, the screen shifted again, scrolling through thousands of lines of red highlighted financial data. Marcus's private offshore account numbers, the falsified spoilage logs, and the direct link between the store's losses and his personal gain. Marcus began to backpedal, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of innocence. He stammered that this was a setup, a deep fake, a sophisticated hack by a disgruntled trespasser. He looked at the faces of the people he had spent years trying to impress, but all he saw was a wall of cold, judgmental stone. Even Mrs. Sterling had moved several feet away from him, her face twisted in a look of performative horror, trying to erase the fact that she had been his loudest cheerleader. She tried to slip toward the exit, her heels clicking frantically on the marble, but Kenji turned his head just enough to catch her eye. He told her that she should stay, mentioning that since his firm had just purchased the regional banking group holding her delinquent mortgage, they had much to discuss regarding community standards, and the legal definition of defamation. Mrs. Sterling froze, her designer bag slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a heavy, expensive thud. Kenji took the microphone from Leo, his voice now a resonant, commanding force that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. He told the assembly that his name was Kenji Chen, and for the last 10 years, he had lived with the memory of what men like Marcus did to honest people when they thought no one was watching. He turned to Marcus, who was now literally on his knees, begging for a chance to explain, claiming he was just protecting the brand. Kenji looked down at him with a gaze that was both surgical and final. He told Marcus that a brand is built on people, not just on the price of the wine or the color of the marble. He told him that he wasn't just fired, he was finished. At that moment, the front doors hissed open again, but this time it wasn't a guest. The district attorney stepped through the threshold, followed by 2 uniformed officers. They didn't go for the vagrant this time. They walked straight to Marcus, who was sobbing now, a messy, ugly sound that echoed through the high-end boutique. As the handcuffs clicked shut over Marcus's silk-cuffed wrists, the same officers who had humiliated Kenji days before looked at the floor in shame. Kenji didn't gloat. He didn't scream. He simply watched as the man who had destroyed his father's life was led out into the night, stripped of his title, his dignity, and his future. Kenji turned to Sarah, who was watching from behind the bar with tears of relief in her eyes. He told her that the store would be closed for a week for a full audit, and when it reopened, she would be the one holding the keys as the new general manager. The applause that broke out was no longer for the gala or the wine, it was for the long overdue arrival of justice. The dust from the Gold Gala had long since settled, and the headlines that once screamed of a vagrant's arrest were replaced by news of a massive corporate restructuring. Marcus Thorne didn't get a quiet exit. His mugshot, eyes red-rimmed and panicked, became the face of a $1 million embezzlement scandal. He was sentenced to 7 years in a state penitentiary, a place where his designer suits were traded for coarse orange polyester and his gold Rolex was replaced by a plastic ID band. There was no one to bark orders at in the prison laundry room, and no one cared about his refined taste in balsamic vinegar as he spent his afternoons scrubbing industrial floors, the very manual labor he had once mocked with such venom. Kenji Chen didn't spend his time gloating over Marcus's downfall. Instead, he returned to the store a few weeks later, not in a tuxedo, but in his old gray hoodie and scuffed boots. He walked through the aisles of the Gilded Aisle, which had been renamed Chen and Sons Provisions. The atmosphere had shifted. The air no longer smelled of sterile arrogance and cold perfume, but of fresh bread and warm, welcoming spice. He worked alongside Sarah, who was now the general manager, helping her stock shelves and lower the prices on essential goods. He established the Community Harvest Program, ensuring that the store's premium produce went to local food banks instead of a black market dumpster. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Kenji drove out to the old cemetery on the edge of town. He stood before a modest headstone that bore his father's name. The grass was green and neatly trimmed, a far cry from the neglected plot it had been when Kenji was struggling to make ends meet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gold-rimmed name tag from the store. He pressed it into the soft earth at the base of the stone. He didn't say much, only a soft whisper into the wind, telling his father that the shop was back in the family, and that this time, they weren't going anywhere. He felt a weight lift off his chest that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying for a decade. 5 years passed like a heartbeat. The business had grown into a global retail alliance, but its flagship store remained the heart of the community. One rainy afternoon, a young man walked through the front doors. He looked exhausted, his clothes damp from the storm, and he carried a heavy, tattered bag. A new, younger security guard immediately tensed up, his hand hovering near his radio as he began to follow the young man with a suspicious, narrowing gaze. Kenji, now older with a few streaks of silver at his temples, stepped out from the back office. He saw the scene unfolding, the familiar dance of prejudice about to repeat itself. He walked over and placed a gentle but firm hand on the guard's shoulder. The guard looked up, surprised, and Kenji gave him a small, knowing smile. He shook his head slowly, a silent instruction to stand down. Kenji then turned to the young man, who was bracing himself for a confrontation. Instead of a demand to leave, Kenji offered a warm, genuine smile and asked if he could help him find something, or if he just needed a place to dry off and a hot cup of coffee. The young man's shoulders dropped in a wave of visible relief. He hadn't expected kindness, and that was the tragedy Kenji was determined to fix, one person at a time. As they walked toward the cafe section of the store, they passed a bronze statue in the courtyard, a likeness of a humble shopkeeper holding a basket of fruit. The plaque beneath it didn't list a net worth or a corporate title. It simply read, "Dignity is not a luxury." Karma, Kenji realized, wasn't just about the bad things catching up to the villains. It was about the good things finally finding their way home to those who refused to let the world turn them bitter. True status was never found in the labels a person wore or the size of their bank account, but in the character they showed when they thought no one was watching. The world would always try to judge a book by its cover, but Kenji had made sure that in his corner of the world, everyone got a chance to tell their own story. Kindness was the only currency that never devalued, and respect was a gift that cost nothing to give, but meant everything to receive.